Madeline Rossi had seen blood spill across marble floors, but nothing was crueler than watching her own father push a contract across a mahogany table and trade her life away. Not because she betrayed him, not because she failed the family, because she could not give them an heir. To the Rossi name, she was defective goods, a daughter with no value left, so her father sold her to a monster and called it business. But before the contract could seal her fate, the most feared widower in the city stepped in. The white walls of Dr. Harrison's Upper East Side clinic felt cold and empty. Madeline sat stiff on the edge of the examination table, her hands locked so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Across from her, the specialist gave the diagnosis without emotion. Severe endometriosis, complicated by a rare uterine anomaly. He said it like it was nothing. To Madeline, it was the sentence that made her family decide she was no longer worth protecting. The words blurred together, ringing in Madeline's ears like a death knell. She would never conceive. There would be no miracle pregnancies. Her womb was in the unforgiving eyes of her family's world a barren wasteland. In normal society, this would be a heartbreaking personal tragedy. In the insular, brutal underworld of the New York Cosa Nostra, it was a death sentence. Madeline was the only daughter of Frank Rossi, a notoriously ruthless capo who operated out of Brooklyn. For 23 years, Madeline had been raised as a prized heirloom groomed meticulously, for one singular purpose: to secure a powerful alliance by breeding the next generation of Mafia royalty. She had been promised to Vincenzo, a brutal underboss of a rival family who demanded a minimum of 3 sons. When Frank Rossi received the doctor's call, the "thee" of his paternal love shattered instantly. Madeline returned to the sprawling Rossi estate in New Jersey, the wrought iron gates clicking shut behind her like the lock of a prison cell. Her father was waiting in his study, a glass of scotch in one hand and the crumpled medical report in the other. He didn't ask how she felt. He didn't offer a shoulder for her to cry on. Instead, he hurled his heavy crystal glass against the brick fireplace, shattering it into 1,000 glittering pieces. Worthless. Frank had spat, his face purple with rage. 23 years of feeding you, clothing you, protecting you, and you can't even do the one thing a woman in this family is born to do. Vincenzo called off the wedding. He said he doesn't buy broken merchandise. Her mother, Helen, stood in the corner, her arms crossed defensively, her eyes cold. She offered no defense for her daughter. In their world, a woman without fertility was a liability. Over the next 2 weeks, Madeline became a ghost in her own home. She was stripped of her allowances, her family jewelry, and her dignity. But the true horror was yet to come. Frank Rossi was not a man to absorb a total loss. If Madeline could not be used to build an empire, she would be used to settle his debts. Frank had recently amassed a staggering gambling debt, $3 owed to a volatile Albanian syndicate led by a sadist named Arben Hoxha. Arben didn't care about bloodlines or heirs. He cared about possession, about breaking beautiful things until there was nothing left but dust. The transaction was arranged for a rainy Tuesday night. Madeline was ordered to wear a simple, clinging black dress. She was given no explanation, only shoved into the back of her father's Lincoln Town car. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt as they drove deep into the industrial sector of Queens, pulling up to an abandoned shipping warehouse retrofitted into an underground cigar lounge. The air inside was thick with blue smoke, the smell of stale beer, and the oppressive weight of dangerous men. Madeline walked a step behind her father, her heart hammering against her ribs, her eyes fixed on the scuffed concrete floor. Arben was waiting at a rusted steel table in the back. He was a massive, scarred man with cold, dead eyes. He looked at Madeline, not as a human being, but as a piece of meat on a butcher's block. She's quiet. Arben noted his thick accent scraping against the quiet room. He reached out his rough, calloused fingers, gripping Madeline's chin, forcing her face up. She didn't flinch, though a tremor ran through her spine. She had accepted her fate. She was empty. She was nothing. She's whatever you want her to be. Arben. Frank laughed, a nervous, sweating sound. The debt is cleared. The girl is yours. Do whatever you want with her. I wash my hands of the disappointment. Arben smiled, revealing a row of gold-capped teeth. He pulled a heavy leather satchel onto the table, unzipping it to reveal stacks of Frank's IOUs. A fair trade, Rossi. A Barren for $3 million. I'll make sure she screams loud enough to earn her keep. Madeline closed her eyes, letting the darkness swallow her. She prepared herself for the end of her life. She waited for Arben to drag her away, but the heavy iron doors of the warehouse suddenly groaned open. the sound echoing like a gunshot through the cavernous space. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The music stopped. The low murmur of the Albanian thugs ceased entirely. Even Arben's grip on Madeline's chin loosened. Footsteps slow and deliberate echoed against the concrete. Dominic Romano walked into the dim light of the warehouse. He was 36 years old, built like a heavyweight fighter, but dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit. He was the head of the Romano Syndicate, the undisputed king of the eastern seaboard. Where Frank Rossi was a bottom feeder and Arben was a thug, Dominic Romano was an apex predator. He was a man followed by a permanent shadow. 2 years ago, a rival family had planted a bomb under his wife Camilla's car. Dominic had survived. Camilla had not. Since that day, Dominic had eradicated his enemies with a cold, mechanical precision that terrified even the bravest men in the commission. But his victory had come at a cost. He was left alone to raise 4 wildly traumatized children. Luca, 12 and full of rage, Matteo, 9 and totally withdrawn, Sophia, 6 and plagued by night terrors, and little Bianca, barely 4, who couldn't even remember her mother's face. Dominic was drowning. His home was a battlefield. The nannies quit after a week, the tutors fled, and the women of the syndicate, the widows and daughters of other bosses, circled him like vultures. They all wanted to marry the king, but Dominic knew their game. Any woman who entered his home would inevitably want to bear his new heir, a child of her own blood. In the Mafia, a stepmother with her own biological children was a death sentence for the children of the first wife. History was full of stepmothers who quietly poisoned or marginalized the firstborns to secure the throne for their own offspring. He needed a mother for his children. He needed a woman who was incapable of having her own. Dominic's icy blue eyes scanned the room, bypassing the terrified thugs and landing squarely on the transaction at the back table. He had come to the warehouse to collect a routine territory tax from Arben, but his sharp ears had caught the tail end of Frank Rossi's sickening pitch. A Barren Dominic approached the table. Arben immediately stood nervously, buttoning his jacket. Frank Rossi looked like he might vomit. "Mr. Romano," Arben choked out, stepping away from Madeline. "We did not expect you so soon. The tax is ready in the back. Keep your money, Arben." Dominic's voice was a low, resonant baritone that commanded absolute silence. He didn't look at the Albanian. His gaze was locked entirely on Madeline. She looked back at him. Despite the sheer terror radiating from every man in the room, Madeline's dark eyes held a strange, hollow defiance. She wasn't pleading for her life. She was merely waiting for the axe to fall. It was that resignation, that absolute rock-bottom hopelessness, that struck something deep within Dominic's chest. "Rossi," Dominic addressed Frank without turning his head. "I hear you're settling a debt." "Yes, Don Romano," Frank stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "A personal matter. Family business. Not anymore." Dominic stepped closer to Madeline. He towered over her, his broad shoulders blocking out the dim lights. "The girl comes with me." Arben's face flushed with sudden indignation, his pride briefly overriding his survival instincts. "With respect, Romano, a deal was struck. She belongs to me." Dominic finally turned to look at Arben. The look in his eyes was so terrifyingly blank, so devoid of human empathy, that Arben physically took a step back. "I wasn't making a bid, Arben," Dominic said softly. "I was stating a fact. If you want to argue the point, we can step outside. But only one of us will walk back in." The silence in the room was absolute. Arben swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his thick throat. He looked at Madeline, then at the 2 massive armed enforcers standing silently behind Dominic. Arben raised his hands in surrender. "She is yours." Dominic looked down at Frank. "Your debt to him is clear. But now, Frank, you owe me $3 million and I don't take trade-ins. You have 30 days. Frank's knees buckled, but Dominic had already dismissed him. He looked down at Madeline. She was shivering, the damp cold of the warehouse seeping into her thin dress. Without a word, Dominic slipped off his heavy cashmere suit jacket and draped it over her narrow shoulders. It smelled of expensive cedar and faint gun oil. "Walk," he commanded, gently placing a firm, warm hand on the small of her back. Madeline didn't speak. She allowed herself to be guided out of the suffocating warehouse and into the crisp, rainy night air. A black armored SUV was idling by the curb. Dominic opened the rear door himself, waiting for her to slide into the luxurious leather interior before climbing in beside her. The divider rolled up, sealing them in absolute privacy. The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving her old life behind in the rain. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers. Madeline sat rigidly against the door, clutching Dominic's jacket around her chest. Her mind was racing. Why would the most powerful, ruthless man in the city buy a woman who couldn't give him an heir? She finally whispered, her voice raspy and dry. My father, he must have said it loud enough for you to hear. I'm defective. I can't have children. If you bought me for leverage or to breed a new line, you just wasted $3 million. Dominic poured a glass of water from a small console and handed it to her. His massive fingers brushed against hers. Drink, he said. She took a sip, her eyes never leaving his. Dominic leaned back into the leather seats, watching the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I didn't buy you, Madeline. I rescued you. And I heard exactly what your father said. He turned to face her, his expression softening just a fraction, revealing a profound, hidden exhaustion. I don't need an heir, Dominic said, his voice dropping to a quiet intensity. I already have 4 children. 4 children who have lost their mother, who are terrified of the world, and who need someone to protect them. Every woman in my circle looks at my sons and sees obstacles to their own future children. They look at my daughters and see competition. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto hers. Your father called you defective. I call you perfect. I need a woman who will look at my 4 children and know with absolute certainty that they are the only children she will ever have. I need a mother who will fight for my blood as if it were her own. I offer you my protection, my name, and a life where no one will ever dare lay a hand on you again. In return, you will heal my family. Madeline stared at him, the heavy words sinking into her fractured soul. For the first time since the doctor's clinic, a tiny, fragile spark of purpose flickered in her chest. She wasn't being sent to a slaughterhouse. She was being sent to a broken home, and perhaps for the first time in her life, her deepest flaw was exactly what made her invaluable. The massive wrought iron gates of the Romano estate parted with a heavy metallic groan, revealing a winding driveway paved with crushed limestone. The property, securely nestled within the wealthy enclave of Oyster Bay, Long Island, was less of a traditional family home and more of an impenetrable modern fortress. Towering oak trees cast long, sprawling shadows over the meticulously manicured lawns, while discreet security cameras blinked with small red lights from the ivy-covered brick walls. Dominic's armored SUV glided to a smooth halt in front of a sprawling 3-story limestone mansion that radiated both staggering wealth and a profound, echoing isolation. Madeline stepped out of the vehicle, the crisp, salty air from the nearby Long Island Sound biting at her cheeks. She was still wrapped tightly in Dominic's heavy cashmere jacket, her mind a turbulent storm of disbelief and apprehension. Inside the house was a masterclass in elegant minimalism, adorned with imported Italian marble floors and a sweeping dual-curved staircase. However, it felt utterly devoid of warmth. There were no photographs of smiling faces lining the hallway consoles, no scattered toys to trip over, and no lingering scent of home-cooked meals. It felt exactly like what it was, a heavily guarded museum housing 4 deeply traumatized orphans. Dominic led her upstairs, bypassing the opulent master wing entirely, and instead ushered her toward a sprawling suite, situated directly across from the children's bedrooms. This is your space, Dominic stated, his voice a low, gravelly rumble in the quiet corridor. The room was breathtaking, featuring a king-sized bed dressed in pristine white fret linens, a private balcony overlooking the dark waters of the Sound, and a massive walk-in closet that was currently empty. My men will retrieve whatever belongings you wish to keep from your father's house tomorrow. Though I suggest starting fresh. You are a Romano now, even if only in name and duty. We will formalize the paperwork by the end of the week. And the children? Madeline asked, her voice trembling slightly. When do I meet them? Tomorrow morning, Dominic replied, a sudden fleeting look of utter exhaustion washing over his sharp features. But I must warn you, Madeline, they are not easy. The staff refers to this wing as a war zone behind my back. Do not expect them to welcome you with open arms. They have chased away every professional caregiver on the eastern seaboard. Madeline nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting a sudden quiet resolve. Professional caregivers get paid to tolerate them. I have nowhere else to go. I can afford to be patient. The next morning, the sprawling mahogany dining table felt like a frozen battlefield. Madeline arrived early, wearing a simple, elegant ivory sweater and dark slacks she had found provided in her temporary wardrobe. She stood quietly near the doorway as the 4 Romano children were escorted in by a stern-faced nanny who looked like she was counting down the seconds until her shift ended. Luca, at 12 years old, was the spitting image of his father. He possessed the same dark hair, the same piercing blue eyes, and an aura of intense, simmering rage that felt entirely too heavy for a child. He glared at Madeline with naked hostility. Matteo, 9, refused to make eye contact with anyone. His shoulders hunched as he protectively gripped the hand of 6-year-old Sofia. Sofia looked pale and exhausted, bearing deep, bruised circles under her eyes from yet another night plagued by severe terrors. Finally, little Bianca, a chubby-cheeked 4-year-old, simply stared at Madeline with wide, unblinking curiosity while clutching a ragged stuffed rabbit. "Who are you?" Luca demanded, his voice cracking slightly but layered with venom. He didn't sit down. "Are you another one of my father's hired babysitters? Because you can pack your bags right now. We don't want you here." Madeline did not flinch. She did not offer a falsely sweet smile. Nor did she adopt the high-pitched, patronizing tone that most adults use to placate angry children. Instead, she walked slowly to the table and took a seat opposite him, folding her hands neatly on the polished wood. "My name is Madeline," she said evenly, projecting a calm, steady authority. "And I am not a babysitter. I am not here to be your best friend, and I am certainly not here to replace your mother. I am here because your father asked me to make sure you are safe, fed, and protected. I have nowhere else to go, Luca. So, you can yell, you can break things, and you can try to scare me away, but I promise you it will not work. I am staying." Luca blinked visibly, taken aback by her blunt, unapologetic honesty. He was accustomed to women who pandered to him, women who feared him, or women who desperately tried to win his affection to get closer to his powerful father. Madeline offered none of these things. She simply offered a sturdy, immovable presence. He scowled fiercely, kicking the leg of the table before dropping into his chair in brooding silence. The breakthrough did not happen overnight. For 2 agonizing weeks, the Romano household remained a tense, delicate ecosystem. Luca tested Madeline relentlessly, deliberately destroying a priceless antique vase, and refusing to complete any of his assignments for his elite private tutors. Matteo remained entirely mute, retreating further into his solitary world. The turning point arrived during a violently stormy Tuesday night. Thunder rattled the thick, bulletproof windows of the estate, masking the sounds of the sprawling house. Madeline was awake, reading a thick novel in her suite, when a shrill, blood-curdling scream pierced through the hallway. She dropped her book, sprinting barefoot across the cold marble corridor, and bursting into Sofia's bedroom. The 6-year-old was thrashing violently in her bed, tangled helplessly in her sheets, her eyes wide open, but completely vacant, as she screamed for a mother who would never answer. Madeline didn't hesitate. She didn't call for the night nurse or the heavily armed security guards stationed downstairs. She climbed directly into the small bed, pulling the thrashing, hysterical child firmly against her chest. "I've got you," Madeline whispered fiercely, ignoring the sharp kick Sofia accidentally delivered to her shin. She wrapped her arms around the girl, creating a tight, secure cocoon. "You are safe, Sofia. I am right here. The monsters cannot cross the threshold while I am holding you. I promise." She began to hum a low, soothing lullaby, an old, melodic Italian tune her own grandmother used to sing before her family had completely fractured. Slowly, agonizingly, the violence subsided. Sofia's panicked gasps turned into soft, rhythmic breathing. The little girl instinctively buried her tear-streaked face into Madeline's neck, her small hands tightly gripping the fabric of Madeline's sweater as if she were a physical lifeline. Standing silently in the shadowed doorway, Dominic watched the entire scene unfold. He had rushed upstairs at the sound of the scream only to find Madeline already there managing the crisis with a profound instinctive grace that he had not witnessed since Camilla's death. Dominic felt a strange, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. His decision, born out of desperate necessity in a grimy Queen's warehouse, was transforming into something extraordinary. The Barren woman, discarded by her own flesh and blood, possessed a boundless capacity for fiercely protective love. By the end of the month, the suffocating tension in the estate began to thaw. Matteo started quietly sitting beside Madeline in the sprawling conservatory while she painted, eventually handing her a brush and speaking his first words to her. Bianca routinely demanded to be carried by Madeline, falling asleep on her lap during chaotic afternoons. Even Lucas's hostility faded into a grudging, silent respect. Madeline never lied to them, never patronized them, and most importantly, she never looked at them as stepping stones to secure a biological heir, because she couldn't. They were her only chance at motherhood, and she guarded them with the ferocity of a lioness protecting her cubs. While peace blossomed within the fortified walls of the Oyster Bay estate, a lethal storm brewed in the city. Frank Rossi was a desperate cornered animal. His 3-0-day deadline had expired, and he did not have Dominic Romano's $3 million to. To make matters worse, Frank's reputation within the commission was in tatters. Selling his daughter to an Albanian thug disgusted the old guard bosses, leaving Frank politically isolated and financially ruined. In his blind desperation, Frank made a fatal miscalculation. He reached out to Arben Hoxha, meeting him secretly in a midtown Manhattan steakhouse. Over bloody cuts of prime rib, the two men conspired to execute a massive leverage play. They knew Dominic loved his children above all else. If they could snatch one of the heirs, Dominic would gladly forgive the debt and likely pay 10 times that amount in ransom to get his child back safely. They targeted Luca. The boy attended Friends Academy, an elite private school nestled in the quiet woods of Locust Valley. Despite the heavy security constantly surrounding the Romano children, Frank possessed insider knowledge. He knew the precise routes, the blind spots in the perimeter, and the exact rotation schedules of Dominic's enforcers. The ambush occurred on a crisp Friday afternoon. Madeline had insisted on riding in the armored Range Rover to pick Luca up from school. She wanted to surprise him, having finally convinced the estate chef to bake his favorite Italian pastry. The SUV idled securely by the wrought iron gates, flanked by a trailing car containing 3 armed guards. As the dismissal bell chimed across the pristine campus, Luca emerged from the heavy oak doors, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He spotted the familiar black vehicle and began walking toward it, offering a rare wave to Madeline, who was smiling broadly through the tinted glass. Suddenly, the tranquil afternoon shattered into absolute chaos. A heavy commercial delivery van violently smashed into the trailing security car, pinning the guards inside. Simultaneously, a sleek black sedan screeched to a halt, directly blocking the Range Rover's path. 4 men wearing tactical masks and wielding automatic weapons spilled onto the pavement. "Lock the doors," Madeline screamed to Gregory, the driver, panic seizing her throat, but she realized with horrifying clarity that Luca was still outside, standing frozen on the sidewalk, his eyes wide with raw terror, as 2 masked men sprinted toward him. Gregory reached for his weapon, shouting into his radio for backup, but Madeline didn't wait. In that fraction of a second, instinct overrode any sense of self-preservation. She threw open the heavy armored door, lunging out of the secure vehicle and sprinting directly into the crossfire. "Luca, get down!" Madeline shrieked, diving across the concrete just as the first masked man reached out to grab the boy's jacket. She slammed into Luca, using her entire body weight to tackle him behind the brick column of the school's entrance gate. As she moved, a deafening crack split the air. Madeline felt a blinding agony rip through her left shoulder, tearing through flesh and muscle with the force of a speeding freight train. She gasped, the breath knocked completely from her lungs, but she refused to let go. She dragged Luca down into the dirt, curling her body entirely over his trembling frame, effectively turning herself into a human shield. Blood poured from her shoulder, soaking rapidly through her blouse, but she gripped the boy tighter, pressing his face securely against her chest, so he would not have to watch the violence erupting around them. "I have got you," she gasped, her voice strained, echoing the promise she had made to his sister. "I have got you, Luca. You are safe." The violent skirmish lasted less than 60 seconds. Gregory and the surviving guards laid down a relentless hail of suppressive fire, neutralizing 2 attackers and forcing the remaining assailants to flee rapidly in the black sedan. The wail of approaching police sirens cut through the ringing silence of the aftermath. Luca, shaking violently beneath Madeline, looked up at her pale, blood-drained face. "Madeline, you are bleeding. You are bleeding so much. It is okay," she whispered, her vision beginning to swim with dark spots. "You are safe. That is all that really matters." Her grip loosened and she succumbed to the darkness. When Madeline opened her eyes, the lights of a hospital room blinded her. Her arm was bandaged. She turned, finding Dominic sitting motionless. "Luca," she croaked. Dominic took her hand. "He's unharmed because of you." She sighed. "Good. Auburn and your father planned it," Dominic said. They are dead. I handled it. There are no threats remaining. The door creaked open and Luca slipped inside. He walked to the bed, tears in his eyes. You took a bullet for me, he whispered. Thank you, Mom. The words struck Madeline and tears spilled down her cheeks. Dominic watched Madeline with his children, and something inside his guarded heart finally gave way. He stood, pulled a velvet box from his jacket, and opened it to reveal a flawless diamond ring. I do not want a marriage of convenience anymore, he said quietly. I want you beside me as my equal. As my wife. Madeline looked at the man everyone feared, the man who had protected her when her own blood had sold her away. He had not saved her because she was useful. He had chosen her because she mattered. And in that moment, she understood the truth. She was not broken. She was not defective. She was exactly what this fractured family needed. Yes, she whispered, still aching, but smiling for real. This time, it would not be a contract. It would be a real wedding. Madeline Rossi's story proved that family is not always born through blood. Sometimes it is built through loyalty, sacrifice, and the one person willing to stand beside you when everyone else throws you away. If this dark mafia romance pulled you in, hit like, share it with someone who loves ruthless devotion and emotional revenge, and subscribe for more stories where broken women rise, dangerous men kneel, and love survives the fire.